Well, thank you for everybody for this morning. It was really just so gratifying to hear about your work. We've been familiar with, of course, with your work for some time, but to hear what's happening and to also hear about some of the conversations taking place here today between different folks and groups, that's also very encouraging. That really kind of leads us into the first panel today. One of the goals that we have as a foundation is, that sounds kind of highfalutin, doesn't it, Stephen? Yeah, that's exactly right, is to promote collaboration between our grant recipients. This is the kind of world in which we can do that. I mean, a lot more easily than we could have just not that many years ago. Now, of course, we're very sober, realistic about that because we know that not everybody's running exactly in the same direction. So those collaborative events and experiences will have to take place in the retail business of living and conversation. And but we do want to encourage that, and not for the sake of community or solidarity or unity, but for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the message that all of us here are committed to proclaiming and to standing behind. And maybe, just maybe, as we work together a bit more and as we think together a bit more about how we might promote the freedom of the gospel, some of the edges we have could be rubbed off a little bit. And we might open our eyes and see one another a bit more differently. And that's always a good thing, right? So what we've done is we've put together a couple of panels here today. And the first one is to just have a conversation about how we might promote between ourselves and elsewhere, among others, the Gerhard Ferdie's work. What are some of the obstacles to doing that? And then what are some of the things that we immediately see are good possibilities for working together and promoting the work of Gerhard Ferdie, and of course, as Mark was pointed out, and others, Luther fundamentally, at the end of the day, Luther's view of the gospel. So where do we have the list of who's on the first panel? Or if you know you're on the first panel, come on up. That's even better. If you know you're on the first panel, yeah. Well, you see how smart these folks actually are here, okay? If they can get this right, we have hope, all right? Okay, there's a couple of microphones here, and just pass it around as you will. And, we're just going to toss you the softball, and you guys swing away, okay? That's how it'll work. So I guess the opening question is, as I said, what are some obstacles to working together to promote the theology of the cross, a la Gerhard Ferdie? And what are some of the things that are working and that we could promote and strengthen as we move along together? Now, that's a broad question and should make it easy for you, okay? Yeah, really, yeah, that's right. So whoever wants to start, feel free, dive in. And Stephen and I will jump in as we will.
I think in this theme of freedom that we're talking about, and this is, in 1991, I showed up at seminary and Ferdie's teaching, and so I found out I'm a Lutheran by him and Nestigan. But it was this thing that Ferdie talked about, which was so distinct, and that is the idea that to be a confessional Lutheran is an event, not a doctrine. And that was key, because what often happens when you start taking something that is a proclamation and dogmatizing it or systematizing it, you actually bind it. And that's why Ferdie wrote that book on justification by faith, death to life. And he recognizes it's the explosion. And so I think one of the hindrances that happens is when somebody comes in and starts putting categories or expectations of how this can or should look. And so they start to do things that the Apostle Paul warns us in Galatians 2:4, that the spies sneak in and try to bring the law back into this. And so they'll put some restrictions on who can and can't proclaim this, or they'll start doing some reflections back of their regrets of why they did this and they shouldn't have done that, or what, that kind of thing. And so I think the moving forward is always keeping in mind that it's a proclamation that is an event that explodes into freedom. And freedom is not something that can be manufactured, as Ferdy always talked about, or legislated, because then it's not freedom. But once you start hearing a legislation of boundaries, then that's the hindrance. And so that's part of the challenge that we have, is to say, how is it we keep it at an event in a proclamation? And as you know, Steve then went on to teach also on what makes the Augsburg Confession, and that is an eschatological event, not a follow it by this rule, here's how we narrow it. So it's recognize that, just being aware of how we will do that, and then keeping it moving in that direction. Again, we'll naturally, institutions are in the law, they can't other be that. So then when you become self-preserving, you'll bind that, but that's part of the challenge.
I'm going to speak for me personally for a second, rather than sort of organizationally or even denominationally. There's an inherent challenge for 1517 when it comes to this, because if we even just look at my history, by the time I became aware of what you would call, I guess, Freudian theology, I was already pretty theologically educated at that point. I was a late comer to the whole experience. I had come up in the LCMS. Most of my theological education was in the LCMS. And while it's, I relish that, especially all my training under Rod Rosenblatt, it was different in sort of a methodological approach to how this happens. Like within the LCMS, the discussion of theology is often very much done in teaching and in teaching categories and things like that. And when I came across Jim Nestigan and was first introduced to the idea of from Ferdy that theology is for proclamation, and that the only really reason to do theology at all is to proclaim the good news, the salvation of sinners to sinners, and say for you, rather than just in my world, even to this day when I travel around to churches and the sermon, when they talk about Jesus, it'll be like an all-inclusive. Jesus died for us. Jesus died for the sins of the world, which is all true and great. But there's a category change when you look at a person and say, Scott, Jesus died for you, right? That's a whole different thing. And that's the big part that influenced me. And then eventually, and you saw it in the video, Christ for You, where that part of the influence came to 1517. Our challenge in that, our particular challenge in that, comes from the fact that most of the people that helped form 1517 and a lot of people that utilize it are LCMS. Not so much majority anymore, but still a good number. And that's a cultural difference and a categorical difference that they have to wrestle with when they find it too. And so what we found is that you send that message out to the world who doesn't know Christ, and by its being a very personal event, as Chris said, is just, it's amazing, right? They encounter Christ for the first time, and it changes everything. And that's awesome. And then there's the challenges of because we're basically an online organization, then there's a challenge of, okay, what now, right? So you get these emails that I wasn't a believer, or I'd been in church my whole life and never really heard the gospel, and then we came across X, Y, or Z lecture or blog or podcast and started listening, and now we are, and now we need to know what to do. And it's like, great, I need to know what to do with you too, and I don't. And so the challenge then becomes in plugging them into a place, a specific place, where they can show up every Sunday and where they can have a preacher that will put that word into their ear every Sunday, and will put the body and blood of Christ into their mouth every Sunday, and will baptize their children, and on and on. So collaboratively, things like this, in a sense, are good for me just because I meet more pastors here who serve at congregations, and it increases the list that we can say, if you're in this area, go try this out. And then I think we can have that discussion together for all of us. Like, what do we do now? You train pastors. Where do you put them? How do you find faithful congregations that are looking for faithful pastors? Same with you. And Paul's doing this work of how do we get this faithful message out to more people in a way that, is challenging for people now. It's long form reading. That's different than it used to be for most people. How do we do that? And we can have those discussions in a place like this. And I'm thankful for it because it's not easy to have those, when you're also trying to teach people about the how deep this theology is, to reach into a group of people that already have that, and then just have the sort of the logistical conversation is a good spot to be in. So I'll be done now.
I'm going to speak from experience both in the classroom teaching Gen Z students, and as my other important vocation as a mom of 2 high school teenage sons at home who speak a different language and understand the world a little differently than I do. And I say, who are you yelling at? Are they a cousin of yours or a brother? What? Bruh? For me, I'm going to say that the focus on Ferdy's theology of the cross breaks down barriers by offering freedom and offering hope. And when I think about Gen Z kids, I think about Gen Z students have so many questions, and they want authenticity. They don't want marketing, and they don't want slick material, and they're distrustful about institutions. The same time that they're distrustful of those institutions, they're really craving community. I also, one of you, I think Dave mentioned The Anxious Generation. I read that book, Jonathan Haidt, over winter break. And that was a hard read, thinking about this idea that the way technology has impacted young adults, and in particularly girls, have been more significantly impacted by being online, social media, things like that. I see so many students trying to climb up the ladder. I see so many students stuck in the merit machine. And they hear a message, or they get stuck on this idea of doing more. Focus on yourself, achieve. And I think Ferdy understands the need for a solid grounding, and the theology of the cross removes any ability we have to measure our progress in the Christian life. And that is hopeful, and that gives us relief. Scott, in preparation, I read, I think, one of your articles where you talked about God blows up my old Adam with the dynamite of the gospel. Am I quote remembering that right? And then it is his work that saves us from beginning to end. I do nothing to save myself. He does everything. And so in the classroom, I can say a theologian of the cross says what a thing is, and that there is authenticity in that students are looking for, and they recognize a fraud. We don't do the world any good by pretending to be pious or being a sentimental optimist. And so I am thankful to be in the role that I am, to get to walk alongside students, to walk alongside my own children, to think about the theology of the cross offering hope, and that we get to work together, and that's the good news.
That's a Rod Rosenblatt line, by the way, dynamite of the gospel thing.
I've taken the assignment about collaboration quite literally and practically, about the relationships of Lutheran Quarterly to the other grantees, and some ideas about connections. It might seem that theoretical and historical research and the kind of publishing we do would be the most abstract and far removed from concrete events, but I'm here to say otherwise. Our energies in research and writing and publishing are not ends in themselves. We are an auxiliary. We want to supply materials, both in hard copy and on our website and through the YouTube channel and so on, for teaching and preaching. So in a way, we are an auxiliary to any one of these other organizations, insofar as they would have a use for hard copy or digital, Lutheran Quarterly or the Lutheran Quarterly books, or the other resources that we can post on our website. So, for example, I have today a little stack of sample Lutheran Quarterlies from the beginning with Gerhard Forde essays to recent, very current issues to give to our colleagues here on the panel and the others who are in the other panel as samples of the hard copy product that we have. And a challenge or a problem is easily overcome when you happen to see someone in person, but there's also luggage and shipping charges, and South Africa's a long ways away. I'm giving this colleague a couple of issues, but we have given the full run of Lutheran Quarterly to 2 African seminaries in Addis Ababa, in Tanzania, and it takes work and money and planning to ship. I mean, we're in our 40th year pretty soon, 160 issues, and to arrange for a subscription, a subscription in perpetuity, which can be digital or hard copy. So I have some, it's like party favors, I guess. I have some handouts here, things to give my colleagues here, including some off-prints and some issues, including that first issue with Gerhard Forde's essay on radical Lutheranism. But this continues into the future, and we have arranged this year, later this year, soon, our spring issue will be part of an open access trial or a pilot project by Johns Hopkins University Press, our publisher. And our journal has been included in this pilot project. So Lutheran Quarterly will become an open access journal, at least in its digital form, for everyone everywhere. And we have to find out how to post the links and so on our website. But that's, I think, a pilot project for 3 years. So we're eager to share the wares that we have. And also for the Lutheran Quarterly books, we can, as copyright partners and permission holders, we can share these things. And we can even get an author's discount from Augsburg Fortress for copies of the Forde book, one about the essays by Forde, Essential Forde, and so on. Or the ones coming out this year, the Promisio by Oswald Bayer that I mentioned. So part of what we do is try to help distribute these materials, hard copy, digital, both the journal and the books. I'll mention while I have the microphone 2 projects that are ongoing, which will we know involve collaboration with these colleagues and others who are here today. With Nick Hopman's organizational leadership, we're going to develop the definitive Gerhard Forde bibliography. That is to say, of his printed works, not recorded sermons and so on that are another category, but whatever's been printed of his essays and books. You might think that's been done, but it's only been done partially. A comprehensive bibliography would include how an essay that was first in a journal was reprinted in this book and in that book, and maybe translated into some other language. And it would be an ongoing bibliography because his works continue to be published, reprinted, translated. So there would be an initial deposit, open access on our website of the definitive Forde bibliography, and then probably annual updates of what more comes along. And lastly, and most concretely, we had a nice lunch meeting today with the budgetary room for us to expand a little bit, thanks to 1521. We've developed a new program, Lutheran Quarterly Lectures. These will be public lectures that would, we hope, be in a place and a venue where we have good attendance in person and live stream, but also then printed in the Quarterly. And a year from now, a year from April, coming up then in the spring of 26, the chosen topic and lecturer and venue illustrate collaboration between the grantees. The topic is the legacy of Gerhard Forde. The lecturer is Timothy Wengert, associate editor, who's co-editor of the Book of Confession, the Book of Concord, and known to many Lutheran students and pastors and lay people for other works as well. But the venue is going to be at Grandview University in Des Moines, Iowa. You see, where we have the Ferdy Professorship now on the faculty, as you've heard. So we will not only have that lecture there, it might be live streamed, we're not sure about the technology on that, but we will not only have the lecture, the public lecture there, we will have our board meeting there. Thanks to their hospitality, and we had a good luncheon meeting today with Tricia and Mark to talk about the particulars of hosting that meeting in April of 26 as partner grantees of 1521. So there's our collaboration report card. You want to speak to it? Or?
He's like, I'm good.
Well, I wonder, Heinz, could you talk a little bit about the curriculum you use at the seminary? And if I think John Pless has brought some Ferdy materials down there. Is that correct for the library? Yeah.
Yes, that is correct. Yes. But there's always material. I mean, we teach a 3-year course, and there are 30 different courses. The students take 5 courses a semester, 10 a year. And for most of the courses, we use textbooks from the States. Also, those of Wingate, the Augsburg Confession, and Formula of Concord. But it's very expensive, not to purchase the books. If you have to pay in South African rands and have them shipped to South Africa, that's always a challenge for us to get hold of books.
Doesn't John Pless, I believe, brings, his allotment of checked suitcases every year full of books for you guys, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So that's pretty cool.
I think one of the difficulties or obstacles in conveying something about Ferdy's theology is that he is not here to do it in person. And there is always something, especially with a great teacher, about actually getting something directly, personally from such a person. And Julie mentioned this about Jim Nestigan, the same sort of thing. And it's difficult to talk about how you communicate a theology that comes out of somebody like Gerhard Ferdy when he's not there actually giving it himself. But the answer to this is in his writings. So you've been hearing a little bit about how his writings can be used and can be offered up and so on. I remember asking him one time what his secret was for being so effective in writing. And he usually didn't, that's a compliment, of course. And he said, well, I don't know. The only thing I know is that I write exactly as I talk. And that actually does come across in his writings so that you can read it and kind of hear it as if somebody's talking to you. And then that leads me to another thing that is, Scott mentioned this and others as well. One of the geniuses of this theology, Gerhard's theology used by Jim Nestigan and Gerhard and others, many of us in the room here as well, is that it always taught the difference between what is called first order and second order speech. And you remember that not only is this done when you teach people how to speak, but this is done in literature, how you teach people how to write. And you teach them the difference between first and second order. And second order is when you go into explanations. And when, you've heard this phrase many times, you're talking about something rather than to somebody. And when you're doing that, you're giving a kind of encyclopedia, an explanation of something or whatever it might be. And second order always comes off as sort of overly teachy, and in the bad way that we say preachy. This is you're preaching at me, and we don't like it. And second order is also the life of the mind. So it's when you go up into your mind and you're just communicating supposedly from one mind to the other. But Ferdy was the only person I have ever met in my life who never operated in the second level. He always was first order. He was not second order. And that was most famous when he was teaching in a class. So he would go on and on about one thing or another. And then, of course, there are always questions. But whenever a question was asked, he never gave an explanation like you would find in an encyclopedia. And he never responded to anybody, like I always do, with giving a nice little oration about something. So he would always stay in the first order, and it would always come back like this. So somebody would ask him, did you really mean that the law comes to an end? And Gerhard would look at the student and say, I can't believe you said that. Or, is that what you really think? Or what are you afraid of? You've heard all these things. So he'd say to the student, what are you afraid of? And then there was immediately, of course, a first order interaction between the two, which is sometimes called I to thou. I'm speaking to you as a you. And we've heard this also with how you talk to Gen Xers and so on. They want, what's the word? Again, they want something that's real, or what's the word? Authentic. So they want authentic. Authentic is first order rather than second order. They know as soon as you're floating up here in second order that you're not authentic and that you're talking not to them, but you're talking kind of over them, or you're kind of giving advice or instructions and so on. And Gerhard would just do that. He would just stay in first order. And I've never seen anyone else who could possibly do it. And he refused ever to step out into second order. That meant that he was always speaking to a person. And he was always speaking as an I to a you. And then consequently, he was always hearing it back. He was hearing how they were saying something to them. And he knew that the question they asked was not just an intellectual thing. Every time a person asks you a question, especially, of course, when you're talking about Bible or theological matters, they're making a confession that's coming out of their heart. They're telling you what they actually believe, what they're afraid of, what they're confessing in life. And Gerhard understood that. This particular kind of theology understands that. And it marks a great difference between in forms or types of communication. Now, it's difficult to do that, but I've seen people do it. I've heard preachers who do it. And when we can reproduce it, then we're operating in that kind of Ferdian theology that we're talking about.
I heard
Thank
Steve
you,
Paulson
Stephen.
say Gen Xers are young people.
Okay. We have these marvelous folks here with us today, and let's have some questions from you. We'll open it up to the floor. Somebody might want to inquire for. Go, Russ, you want to start? Oh, sure you do. Of course you do.
I have a question.
Yeah.
One of the things, what Steve said just hit me really hard, because I, of course, didn't have Ferdy as a professor. So most of what I know from Ferdy is from reading. The exception to that is a series of lectures that he gave at Mount Carmel on the bondage of the will that I have we might have even posted it at one point, I don't remember, that I have the audio to, and it's a good listen at least once a year just because you get a little bit of the flavor. Does anybody know more than I do, or are there more of that type material to gather together from somewhere, and would it be a good project to lean into for somebody to find it and organize it and post it?
Yes, that's something that I've actually been talking with someone back in the Midwest about this, and of contacting colleges and seminaries where Ferdy may have lectured, where they might have VHS tapes or cassette tapes or whatever in their catalogs that we could pull together somehow. And so we are actually thinking about that. And so anybody who would like to think about taking that on, we'd be happy to talk to you. But that's something that we want to do. We'd like to flush every Ferdy bird out of the bushes we can find and make it available to people. So yeah, that's good, Scott. Thank you.
You're not going to sit and talk about Gerhard Ferdy, right? You're not going to lead with that. It's really the theological aspect of it. That's what I'm really getting at, the challenge of you all, and Tricia, you're in the classroom, you can mention the name, right? Because you're in a classroom, but really getting that out so people, I don't know what they're talking about, some dead guy, right? What does he know? But really to get that message out. How do you meet that?
There's a couple ways. One, it's kind of funny, as you say, you can't say his name all the time. We just got a podcast review on one of the podcasts I do, Thinking Fellows. It's like, I used to love these guys, but they talk about Ferdy so much. I'm just out now. And it's like, so maybe you're right. You can't mention his name all the time. But I mean, what you have to do is you have to write and talk and podcast and do videos where you're doing your best to encapsulate the theology and to really, like I said earlier, to blow them away with something that they've likely never heard before, regarding freedom in the gospel of Christ being expressly for them, in their brokenness and their despair and their anxiety and their feelings of success and wanting to constantly chase success in all of those places. And then I think you can eventually lead people into, because inevitably once the, hey, I'm blown away, this is amazing, wears off, they want to know, where can I get more of it? And when you kind of get to the stage of where can I get more, you can start talking about Ferdy and Nestigan and the individual people. The good news is there are voices out there that are trying to do their best to represent Luther's theology and Ferdy's theology already, and they can get to know those voices too, like Steve Paulson or whoever is trying to do a good job at that, and they can hear a modeled version of that through these other people too, and that's amazing. Now Gen Z, I mean, Dave talked about it in his talk. He did a little bit more on what short form video is. I'm convinced that short form video is a hook, but it's like the invitation to dinner, but it's not dinner. And I think you have to, through short form videos, including ones that would be expressly, for you style theological content videos and introductions to people like, who is Martin Luther? Who is Gerhard Ferdy? Who is Jim Nestigan? Who is Philip Melanchthon? On and on and on, right? That you can invite people to dinner and hopefully eventually they sit down at the table and then you can actually feed them a real meal. Because short form video isn't going to get anybody, all the way anywhere. So.
This may end up ending our funding from 1521. But I would say that I actually think Ferdy would say this, and this is what Steve was getting at in his original talk today, was Ferdy wanted to replicate Luther. And so I think if we all sit there and say that our mission is what Ferdy thought the mission was, which was conquer the definition of sin, which is unbelief. And if we're all about getting rid of unbelief, that is something that you don't ever have to mention Ferdy about. But you have to deliver what Ferdy wanted delivered, which is what Luther wanted delivered. And that crosses, again, gets you out of the denominationalism. It gets you out of the gender divides. It gets you out of because you're attacking not the law of how to be righteous according to it, but the law that makes unbelief. And that really is the key. And so I think as we move forward in collaboration, if the common mission is to attack unbelief and not attack concupiscence, not attack culture wars, not get caught there, because that's literally where the devil wants you, is to claim your own righteousness in who gets to be ordained or who has to do this, or then you've lost Ferdy, because you're not attacking unbelief anymore. You're claiming righteous according to your reading of something or your application of something. And so I think that's really at the heart of it, because that is why Ferdy was the radical freedom. That's what he meant, radical. He didn't mean radical and then put a condition on it. And so I think as we continue to move that forward is, what are we actually addressing? We're not actually addressing Gen Xers. We're not actually addressing Gen Z. We're addressing unbelief, which is then how do we get that into the next podcast, the next video, whatever the case may be. That'd be something I'd propose. So if 1521 says you can't have it anymore, okay, go ahead.
No, it's okay. Your sin is forgiven on account of Christ. Something that occurred to me while you were talking, and when Scott was talking, is there's really only one advocate for the gospel, and that's God. God was in Christ reconciling. God is the one who does the speaking. God is the one who is doing this work. We schlump along here for a few years, doing what we can do, but this is God's work. God's program is to seek and to save. And so I like what you said, Chris, that what's God after? Faith. That's what he always wanted, right? He's after faith. Belief, trust, Adam and Eve, God bless them, they just threw it all overboard. Did God really say? Is that really what he wants? No, I think there's more going on here. Well, I don't want to oversimplify this, but I think you get the point that we can, especially with theology, you can get into the weeds real fast. And it's good to step back once in a while and remember, what is the mind and power at work in all of this? It is the reconciling God who wants to bring sinners into faith. And isn't that why we're here? I mean, right? I'm not a pastor because Gerhard Ferdy was my teacher and Jim Nestigan. They helped, although I think I've told Stephen once that it was many years before, a number of years when I was in the ministry before I actually understood what Jim and Gerhard were actually talking about. I had to go through a divorce and lose my family and go into the pit. And then I thought, oh, that's what they were. That's what it was about. You see, so all of our works and ways and all the things we're doing are marvelous and wonderful, and we've heard a lot about them here today. But he's the one. God is the one who is activating and motivating it all. I think I said that at the end of my little talk this morning, that the fruit will flow from him. Yeah, and that gives me great freedom and peace to know that it actually doesn't depend on me. Yeah. Okay, that's enough of the homily from Pastor Mark. So, anyways, somebody else. Yes, Stephen.
I want to make a promotion again. Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody else is. Please ask your question.
Just have a question. Two of the favorite little books that I have is Gerhard's on Divine Mercy, and also George MacDonald has a history of his sayings, so to speak, even poems. I'm just wondering if we could distill Ferdy into something in that format where you could have access to even short quotes or topics that could be looked at easily. Just curious.
I'll bet that's true. I think we probably could do something like that. This does fit what I was thinking of here. If you are a teacher and then you suddenly die, you don't have much power of communication any longer, except with what you've written. So this means that written things are important from the past. They're also going to be important going forward. So whether that's Lutheran Quarterly, a couple of, 15, 17, and Mockingbird does this also, where you keep one toe or something like that in printed material, because printed material is going to continue to be important even in a world that is primarily, video oriented. We can see that and acknowledge all of that, but we still need written material. This is also how we know Luther. So the way that we know Ferde going forward is also the way that we know Luther going forward, so that you have to go back and read the writings. They can come in different forms. You could give them in nice little quotes. You could pull out all kinds of great quotes from Ferde, but you do need to have some of these things written, and then it is what is written that lasts over a longer period of time. I'll give you one other example. Some of you have heard this story, but we had a group of people from Northern California, from Oregon and into the state of Washington, who got very interested in Ferde. They initially started down here in California as the first Jesus freaks. You remember this? So they were Jesus freaks down here in California. And then they decided that Jesus would want them to be socialists, so that they all moved up to an area where they could afford some land together, and they were all Jesus freak socialists, and deciding that they were going to live the life that Jesus asked. And this went on for some time, and they, in the meantime, were not just socialists, but they decided that if they were going to survive, they were going to actually have to enter the capitalist world and sell things in the outside world. Well, they did that, and they were very, very successful. And then in the middle of this, they had these groups that were trying to be faithful to Jesus Christ, and they started to hate each other. They started to fight and so on. And one of the key pastors in this group he was looking for any sort of help he could possibly find. So he said, I went in one day to the bookstore, and what did I do? I did what any pastor would do. I went into the self-help section. So he went into the self-help section, and he's looking around for books. He's pulling out a book that was going to say something about how to self-help. And he said, as I pulled it out, a book that was two steps above me, 2 shelves above me, fell onto my forehead. It hit me on the forehead and then fell down on the ground. And I looked at it, and it said, on becoming a theologian of the cross, from Gerhard Ferde. He said, I picked it up, and I was never the same after that. And we still have the groups of people up there who are Ferdeites. They're contacting me all the time. Some of you actually know some of them. It's a great group. And they all got this from this particular book. They read this and said, is this possible? Is this actually true? That's the way it was communicated to them. That's how they found it. Took a little knock on the noggin. By the way, it didn't hurt that they were Pentecostal and they believed the Holy Spirit would give them special revelations. Well, there it was. And lo and behold, Ferde was a great prophet and still is in Northern California.
I'm going to do that thing and make a comment rather than a question. Sorry. The 2 things. I think I love the idea of like a short, almost like devotional of just quotes, because he wrote aphoristically a lot of times. Like he had a way with zingers, I've found. In the early days of Mockingbird, when we were tweeting, Ferde quotes tweet well. Because he just understood that maybe in dispositionally. We had like something called Ferde Fridays, where we just posted one paragraph and it would just sort of, people's minds would explode and then they'd go on with their day. But the other thing I was thinking about, if the topic here is how can we spread the message of Ferde, not the message is what's important. I've found in our work, his insights, or resonate with anyone who's had contact with addiction in a very, very powerful way. And young people and just people, period, have become much more comfortable talking about addiction as a universal thing, I think, in the last 10 to 20 years. I think that's actually a really good thing, because we're all so familiar with our willpower being overwhelmed constantly by these things. Like everyone, you don't have to convince people about that. And I would just say, I've found when I'm trying to get someone, the people that I've given on being a theologian of the cross who've been the most excited about it are all addicts. And that's a huge opportunity, because there's a lot of, basically everyone's an addict.
Yeah, I have a question. When I've been, I like studying scripture, and for instance, when I was working through Revelation, I realized that's a whole different world. And you're trying to then figure out, how does this thing that's scripture, that's living, that formed faith, formed a movement 2,000 years ago, how does that work today when we don't understand that world at all, the world of Revelation? And so you almost have to do so much teaching before someone can pick it up and read. Obviously, we don't completely believe that you have to teach that, because you still could proclaim the word's going to be alive. But my question is, for Ferdy, he did exist in a moment. He was writing to things, to a world that is still very much the same world that we live in, but also different, where I'm thinking that some of the things he's bringing up, or even like Free to Be, when I gave it to my young people, the references are a little different. The pictures are different. They don't understand getting someone's phone number, really. So you have to sort of translate. And, so it's different that way. And so as people who are working on transmitting the faith and even transmitting the ideas of Ferdy, what are the challenges, or how are you thinking about that, knowing that, Ferdy stopped speaking a while ago? And how does he speak into this world today when you're using language that he used 30 years ago? So, and there's an audience of young people who maybe don't even understand the Christian categories. So, thoughts, I would love to hear your observations or thoughts about that.
In 1991, Freddie wrote a Word and World dialogue back and forth, and we use this for our confessions class, the very first thing our students have to read. And he's talking about the problem with confessionalization. And he says what happens there is confessionalization, is that it becomes a talking about the language that was used. And I think that's exactly, what you're saying there, Russ, is exactly right. And he would have agreed. The language that I use is a dead language if you're trying to propagate it as a language, as opposed to trying to figure out how you make the event happen again. And so it really is, it's us being, and this is where I like what Russ is trying to do back there a little bit, of trying to say, how is this communicating in short form in that thing? And I'm terrible at, I don't even own a Facebook page, right? So I'm still way, way back. I barely got into a smartphone, but a few years ago. So I don't communicate. My kids will tell you, I don't communicate. The only reason I have an Instagram page is because that's how I find out what they did in life. Otherwise, I wouldn't know what they do in life. So, but the people that are in that and able to converse in that is huge. But that's what Freddie, I think, would want you to do, is not necessarily repeat what he said, but repeat what, try to get it to happen again. And I think, so I agree that even, this is why Luther even goes into something, which is what Freddie got me into, goes into something of difference between Gedicht and Geschichte. When he's talking about, even you're looking at the apocryphal, and he goes, Luther says, it's the Gedicht that makes it worthwhile, and not the Geschichte, the history. It's the story, not the history. And I think that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to historicize Freddie, but we're trying to narrate what he wanted narrated.
I heard two questions, and they felt like they were different questions. One was translating Ferdy, because he stopped talking when he died, obviously. And the other one was sort of the kids these days don't even understand Christian categories. Now, I'm not a kid these days. My kids these days are adults now, and so I'm on the point of grandkids these days. But just from our interaction that we've had through correspondence that people have gotten back to us through 1517 and then classroom teaching with this generation, I don't agree with that, to be honest with you. If you would have said that a decade ago, like when I was at Concordia teaching undergrads in like 2012, I would have totally agreed with that. It was a time when kind of before many of the social movements brought, I think, religious categories back into light, that we really were sort of in this like postmodern milieu and secular milieu where everything was secular. To be honest with you, whether you love them or hate them, what the social justice movements of the last decade have done is they have brought religious and even Christian categories back into the spotlight, where every young person understands the categories. They're probably not introduced to Christ in the way, at least the Geschichte, the history of Christ, that they would have been in sort of our idealized culture of the 1950s and 60s or something like that. But they get the categories of guilt and shame and sin and law and retribution, and you need to confess this. They get all of these things in a way that they haven't in a long time. So you could look at that in one of two ways. You could be real despairing of that and say, oh my gosh, they don't know anything of Christ. Or you could look at it and say, they're 2/3 of the way there, because there's going to be very little law that needs to be preached here. We're almost just like on the cusp of being set to just come in straight with the gospel. And I'd say, heck, just try that. Because you're going to be surprised at how broken down people already are just by the weight of the world and the pressure of all of these religious categories that are down on them every day. And I think we would all know and all say that if it's a religious category that's a Christless religious category, it's law. And it's pressing down on them every day, and they get the language in a way that they hadn't even a decade ago. Maybe I'm wrong, though.
Ferdy's book, Where God Meets Man, when I reread that last paragraph written well over 50-ish years ago, I thought it still sounded awfully relevant. And I wrote it down here. To be a Christian is to live under the sign of him who came from heaven down to earth, to live under the sign of his cross and resurrection, and thus to wait hopefully, patiently on this earth by making it a better place, and to challenge the world through one's vocation in the church to do the same. And I thought that still speaks today. The students in my classroom can hear that, and they get it. They maybe don't have the vocabulary in the background, but they understand that.
From memory, a little bit, the follow-up to that line in Where God Meets Man is Ferdy references, when he's talking about vocation, the fact that he's a teacher. And that when he explains to his student that their vocation as students then is to not, in his time, I think he's writing in the 60s probably, to not go man the social barricades, right? But to do their best to be a good student where they are. I think the line is, or my line, it's their mind is blown. They can't believe that this is what God's calling is to them, to be a good child, to be a good student. And again, these are categories that I think are more open to us now than they were even a decade ago. Don't get me wrong, there is probably more unbelief by the numbers, but the people, it's closer evangelistically.
I have a question for. There we go. I have a question for Heinz, Dr. Heinz. In your students, what's the relationship or the ratio of the learning methods by hard text, copies of books or journals, relative to digital access to texts online. Even we saw some videos here. What do your students use in your classes?
Our students do get textbooks for all the classes, but it's difficult for them because of the language. They're not native English speakers. It's often difficult for them to read and understand. So it's easier to give them something to watch. That's for them much easier to understand. But we often struggle with reading assignments.
So do they watch lectures, or what do they watch?
They do watch lectures, but they just anything they can find on YouTube or so they will watch. They will find something that resonates to them and follow that. So we need more good material which we can give them to watch.
I kept waiting for him to say 15, 17 videos, but okay.
That last discussion brought to mind, is there a need for translating these works into other languages?
The question was, is there a need to translate Ferdy's work into other languages other than English?
So we've been creating all of our lectures online because we're an online thing. And then we've been doing a lot of this translating. AI is going to make a huge difference for us for that. So it's going to put all these kind of things into subtitles. We actually have people actually looking into being able to use AI to narrate all over those as far as that goes. And so, yes, I think in 2 years, our hope, we have this project going on in the Congo right now with French. None of us know French. But the guy that's starting it, he's got his PhD from Luther Seminary, and he's doing this. So yes, I think it will happen. I think it'll be much easier to happen. I think AI will help that. The tricky part is, though, again, is when you're doing that, you're working with the language and the translations, and so you'll have to have people that are theologically attuned in that language to be able to say, that wasn't quite the word to use because AI can't write a sermon, because it really won't deliver it, right? So it can write a language, but so that's going to be an interesting thing that we're going to have in the near future. But yes, our hope is a lot of our stuff we have videos for every lecture now in all of our curriculum that we do. And so that's where, I hope, and I think having a place like at Lutheran Quarterly to say, it's a known brand, here's where we're going to post all these resources available in various forms. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, part of our point in assembling the current, what is published, what has been published, Nick knows some details better than I. We know that there are some translations into Japanese, I think, and Spanish and German. The real future might be in Japanese and in Spanish and not so much into German, but wouldn't rule that out. But the question is there a need? I would think there would be. And first we'll find out what there is, and we hope it will also inspire people to add to that and have a project of translating more Ferdy into more languages.
I do agree that Spanish is going to be one of the big things. Some, at least two of his books are Where God Meets Man, and then I can't remember which one. It has been translated into Spanish. But we have some students from Luther House who are in Central or South America, and they really do want more translations of Ferdy's material and others as well into Spanish. And that's something that we should look at, and 1521 might help with some of that. But there is a real interest in translating into Spanish in particular, I know. So that could work.
Steve Burns would know better than I, but seems like with some of our stuff, there are groups that they want it. They translate it into Spanish at their cost because, yeah, you just license it to them and they do it. So,
Okay, anybody else? One final question?
Dr. Heisterman, about how many languages do your different students speak? I mean, there's the most of them are from South America, but you said also the Sudan. I'm sure that there are different languages that you have to confront.
It's difficult to say exactly how many languages, but I think most students speak at least 3 or 4 languages. The one, at least 15. Yes. And the young man who is now serving as youth missionary in Berlin, he speaks 8 languages.
Okay, thank you folks for being on the spot up here. We appreciate it. And let's take a break and then we'll come back for round 2.